Hi everyone. Today I'm going to give a talk about the use of auxiliary verbs. Hopefully you will find it useful and it can help you to be able to explain how to use these verbs to your students in the future. And if you are going to teach how to use auxiliary verbs, you need to know how to use them very well yourself. So we're going to look at one particular point about auxiliary verbs this time, but in general auxiliary verbs they're known as helping verbs because they help the main verb of a clause. We say auxiliary usually in English, but I think helping verbs is perhaps easier to understand, and it's more similar to the Japanese term ①助動詞. So you can call them helping verbs if you want. Auxiliary verbs have four main functions. They make compound tenses using the main verb. For example, the perfect tense forms using have, which is an auxiliary verb. They're also useful for making negative sentences and questions. And they're also used commonly with the passive voice. So that's another useful way to use them. There are actually two main types of auxiliary verbs. We have the four main ones, which are be, have, will, and do. And then we have the second type, which are sometimes called modal auxiliary verbs, which is a little bit confusing because we also have modal verbs in English, but generally modal auxiliary verbs can be things like can, could, may, might, must, and so on. These four main auxiliary verbs, three of them can actually be used as regular main verbs, but only one of them can never be used as a main verb. Which one do you think it is? Sometimes we even use the same auxiliary verb as the main verb. So the ones which can be used as main verbs are sometimes used as auxiliary verbs too. So we occasionally get sentences like have had or had had, which can be a little bit confusing, or are being is another one with two be verbs. So there are lots of complicated ways in which auxiliary verbs are used. But I have been doing the auxiliary verb course on Fruitful English for a few years now, and so I have experienced hundreds and hundreds of submissions by customers who are trying to master auxiliary verb use. And today we're going to look at what I think is the most common mistake, or the part of auxiliary verbs which I think most people have the biggest trouble with. And I think mastering this part of auxiliary verb use is vital if you're going to become an accomplished English writer, English teacher, or just an English speaker. So I hope that this seminar today can help to put you on the right track to being able to use these words. So let's get started. All right, so let's get started. As you can see, the topic of today's seminar is solving the mystery of can, could, and be able to. And I think these are some of the verbs which, auxiliary verbs, which people really struggle with using. And I can imagine that struggling to explain them is something that will also happen when you try to help your students with them. Certainly I've always found it difficult to explain clearly why we can use these in some situations and why we can't use them in other situations when they seem to basically perform the same function from sentence to sentence. But we will look into that as we progress through today's seminar. So basically, can, could, and be able to have 4 uses. Some of them are used for all of these things. Some of them are used for a few of these, but none of them are used in all of these situations. That is ability, possibility, awareness, and permission. And maybe some of these uses overlap with others. I think occasionally it's difficult to say what is ability and what's possibility. They can be quite similar. Also permission and possibility can seem to overlap, but hopefully I'll be able to explain why they're actually different. But I think this is one of the more complex topics of English grammar. It's certainly not one of the easier things to explain. So, first of all, we're going to look at ability, and ability is probably, I would say, the largest of the 4. It's the one which has the biggest usage in everyday English, and it also affects all forms of tense. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at ability. And we're going to start off with the past tense form. So we can use could or was able to describe past abilities, which is fairly straightforward. So you can see the example sentences here. He could play soccer very well. She was able to get an interview. So I think if you reverse these, he was able to play soccer very well, she could get an interview. Really, there's not a big difference between the two meanings. So this is quite nice and easy to understand. Was able to always means that the person performed the action. So if we say she was able to get an interview, that means she got the interview. However, could sometimes is used to show that although the person had the ability, they didn't actually use that ability, or they didn't actually perform the verb or the action they were capable of doing. And we use could have to show that. For example, you could have written it more neatly. You had the ability to do so, but didn't do it. So you can imagine a teacher or a parent saying to a student or child, you could have written it more neatly. It's a kind of a warning or a telling off. You could have written it more neatly, but you didn't. So it's something I often say to my son. Now, we have variants in the past abilities. A couple of different expressions which are also used using these auxiliary verbs. So first of all, we have could not have. And this shows the lack of ability. So, I could not have committed the crime. I was working at the time. So this is some kind of alibi situation. But I could not have done it. I could not have committed the crime. I didn't have the ability to do it. And then we can combine be able to with used to. And this shows past ability that the situation has changed. And the person is no longer able to do this. I used to be able to finish a Rubik's Cube, but now I can't. I've added but now I can't to really show clearly the meaning of this sentence, but I used to be able to finish a Rubik's Cube has the same meaning, essentially. It still means I can't do it now. In the present tense, can and be able to are used. Not could. Could is really the past form of can in most situations. Now, be able to is, according to most textbooks and style guides, slightly more formal than can. I'm not really sure that I agree with that. I don't think many people really consider one to be more formal than the other, but I guess if I had to say which is more formal, then I would say be able to, but really it's not a big difference. So I am able to speak French. I can speak French. These are basically the same meaning, the same nuance, and maybe slightly different formality, but really not much. In the future, only be able to can be used. We use it with will or shall. To be honest, I think shall is probably not very common these days, I would say. I think that it's definitely more used in British English. I don't think many Americans use shall, if any. And I would also say shall is slightly old-fashioned. But yeah, it's a possible usage, and it is correct, certainly in British English. So I will be able to come next week. I shall be able to come next week is how we describe abilities in the future tense. The point here is if you did use could, there is a possible sentence. I could come next week is a correct sentence, but as we'll see later, it doesn't mean the same thing as I will be able to. It doesn't express ability. I could come next week is basically saying a possibility. It's like saying maybe. And I can come next week is also a possible sentence. But I can come is more definite than I could come. But as I said, neither of these express ability, they both express possibility. And I think this is one of the main things that confuses people about this. All right, before we go on to the next section, which is possibility, there are a couple of more interesting points that I wanted to make in between ability and possibility. And this one is about after modal verbs, the use of these three auxiliary verbs after modal verbs. And as we can see in this example, the only one which can be used is be able to. And we use modal verbs to qualify abilities, to give them a higher percentage or a more likely, a larger likeliness of happening. So things like might or may, which are modal verbs, can be used to qualify be able to. So we can see in the example sentences, I might be able to go to the party, instead of I am able to go to the party. So we're showing this is not certainty. I am able to, 100% ability. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going. It just means they are able to go. I might be able to go shows that the ability is not complete. We don't know for sure. However, I might could go to the party or I might can go to the party are clearly not correct. And this is basically due to them also being used as modal verbs. So we can't really use two modal verbs together. I might could sounds very strange. And the other interesting thing is only be able to has an ing form. There's no canning or coulding. But because be able to contains the be verb, it is possible to use the ing form of a continuous or progressive verb tense. For example, I love being able to have breakfast at home. Being able to speak French makes life in Paris much easier. So we can talk about abilities using a continuous verb form, but only with be able to, which is, I think, fairly obvious. I don't think anybody thinks we can say, I love coulding have breakfast at home. Of course it's not. It's not possible. Next, we have possibility. Possibility and ability can be seen to be very similar, but this is really where most of the mistakes happen. In the present and future tense, we use can and could to talk about future possibilities and present possibilities. This seems counterintuitive because could is normally regarded as the past tense of can. So why is it used to talk about present and future? Because it's not being used as the past tense of can in this situation. It's being used as an auxiliary verb to talk about possibility. And again, that can be pretty confusing. So it can be said that he is an icon to geeks worldwide. I think this was written about an actor whose name escapes me, but he played Superman. And he's also interested in board games and computer programming. So it can be said, it's possible to say that he is an icon to geeks worldwide. You could be the next Brad Pitt. It's possible. Okay, you aren't at the moment, but you know, it's possible that you could be in the future. So as with the with abilities, we also have some variants which are used, and these include just straight up modal verbs might and may, which can be used as options here. So using the same sentences from the previous slide, it may be said, you might be. These sentences can be written with, again, I think very little difference in nuance compared to can and could. It can be said, it may be said, it might be said. I don't think any native speaker knowingly chooses one over the other and thinks that has a higher possibility of those three, or even it could be said as well. I just don't think that enters our minds when we're choosing which one to use, and I don't really think about which one I use when I speak. It really is quite random at times, which is always annoying for students of another language to hear that native speakers use something randomly, because it's much easier if there are rules that say you must use this one in this situation and so on. But sadly, I don't think there is really any system for choosing which word. It is important to remember that I've written here in the negative form, we cannot use could. I think cannot is a little bit strong. It's possible, but I think we shouldn't use could in the negative form, is a better way to describe it. And again, we can use may and might in the negative form to replace them. So that might not be possible is fine, but that could not be possible is a little bit strange. I think it's because if we say that could not be possible, it's exactly the same as saying that isn't possible, because it has such a strong meaning. Another variant is the occasional possibility use of can, unlike could and be able to. We can use can to describe things that are sometimes possible. So a situation that sometimes happens. January and February can sometimes bring heavy snows to the west coast. January and February are able to sometimes bring heavy snows. It's a little bit strange. January and February could sometimes is too vague. If it's sometimes, then it actually happens. Then saying could as a possibility sounds strange. Why are we saying it sometimes happens, and then contradicting ourselves by saying it could happen. So only can is appropriate in this situation. So that's another useful variant use. Now, possibilities in the past. Could have is used to express things that that were possible in the past, even when they didn't actually happen, which is quite difficult to understand. Could not have is used for things that are impossible. They could not have happened. So, he could have been in France in 1994. It's possible. It's possible that he was in France in 1994. Was he in France in 1994? We don't know. And this is very close to being an ability, because if we change it to, let's say, go, he could have gone to France in 1994, then we have a sentence where it's not very clear if it's a possibility or an ability. You know, he could have gone to France in 1994, but he didn't. It is talking about an ability. He could have been in France in 1994 is talking about a possibility. We don't know if he was in France or if he wasn't in France, but it's possible that he was. He could have won the race if he hadn't fallen. So it's possible that he could have won, but he didn't win. So these two sentences are different. The first one is a possibility, we don't know what happened. The second one, it didn't happen. And they both use exactly the same auxiliary verb structure of could have. So we have to be a little bit careful with these types of sentences in particular. And the last example here is something which is not true. It's impossible to be true. He finished last in the race, so he was last place. He couldn't have tried very hard. Okay, if he tried very hard, well, maybe he's not very fast at running. Maybe he's just not very good. But you know, we can imagine logically that if he was in last place, then he didn't try very hard. So it's impossible that he tried hard. He couldn't have tried very hard. Next we have awareness. This is one of the shortest parts of this usage. Awareness is related to the senses. As you know, we have 5 senses. Well, most normal people have 5 senses. Some people claim to have a 6th sense, but I don't really believe in that. But our 5 senses are taste, touch, hearing, sight, and smell. So the verbs we use are taste for taste, smell for our nose, see for our eyes, hear for our ears, and feel for our touch. And these can be used, these verbs can be used combined with can or could to show awareness. And it just means things that we notice, thanks to our senses. So I can see clearly now that the rain has gone. It's actually from a famous song. I'm not going to sing it. But yeah, I can see clearly now. I could smell bread baking somewhere nearby. Now this is not a possibility. This is awareness. I could smell. This is an ability, really. Awareness is kind of an ability. I was able to smell bread sounds a little bit strange. So a pretty short section on awareness there. Next up we have permission, and again this is quite a short section. Can and could are used to show past and present permission for things. You can open a window if you like. My parents said I could go. I can't go out tonight. Negative. My parents said I couldn't go to the movies. Negative again. So in this case, could is used as the past tense of can. And be able to is not relevant to this usage because it's not talking about abilities. So permission is a little bit different from the other types of usage. Now, looking at common mistake, I think this is without doubt the most common mistake that I encounter when doing the auxiliary verb course, and that is being too ambiguous about possibility and ability. So if we write, I was able to speak French when I was young, I could speak French when I was young, it's very clear this is talking about past ability. Whether we can still do that or not, we don't know. It's not important to the meaning of this sentence. It's just talking about a past ability. However, when we remove that when I was young part, we get I was able to speak French and I could speak French. I was able to speak French is still fine because able to is talking about always about a past ability. That I could speak French potentially has two meanings. It could mean the same as I was able to speak French, showing a past ability. Or it could be talking about a future event. You know, I could speak French if I studied. It could be talking about a possibility now. You know, for example, if you have the ability to speak French and you're at a hotel in Paris and your friend said, oh, the hotel staff member didn't understand me when I spoke English to him. And you could say, oh, I could speak French as a suggestion. You know, I could use my French ability to speak to him. So there's too many different possible meanings for this, and it's just very vague and ambiguous. So we do need to be careful when using could to talk about past abilities, particularly when the sentence is short like this and there's not a lot of qualifying information surrounding it. That kind of information is what clarifies the meaning of the sentence. So if I was going to identify the most common mistake, I would say that is it. It's also the topic or the subject that I get the most questions about on the auxiliary verb course, because it's quite confusing. As you can see from these examples, just removing when I was young leaves one of them meaning the same thing and the other one possibly meaning 3 different things. So it's not easy. So another common mistake, this one is actually more common among native speakers, I would say, than people learning English, but is interesting because it's actually a grammatical mistake which comes from speaking into writing. And I think the internet has vastly increased the amount that a lot of people write, or at least write in a forum that other people can see. The problem here is that we often abbreviate could have to could have. However, when we say could have, when we vocalize it, it sounds a lot like could of, OF. And so now if you go onto YouTube or somewhere and look at the comment sections where people write in English, you can find this mistake a lot. I could have gone fishing, spelled OF rather than what it should be, I could have gone fishing. And as I said, this comes about because of the way people say could have in the contracted form, could have. So it's quite an interesting case, but just so that you're aware, we never ever use could of. There is no such expression as could of. It's always could have, regardless of how it may sound. Another, well, not a common mistake, but I think something which is very interesting when considering auxiliary verbs is making use of context. And context can be so important with auxiliary verbs. And in some cases, you can have 2 sentences meaning different things, even though they use the exact same words. Now, obviously, context makes this clear, but also it could be the pronunciation or the intonation used when spoken that gives us a hint about how to judge the meaning of these things. So in this example, we can see we should arrive by 1 p.m. versus we should arrive by 1 p.m. So they're the same. Or are they? So let's imagine a conversation number 1 where we have person A, person B. And let's imagine they are sitting on a train. They're sitting on a train. How long will the journey take? We should arrive by 1 p.m. So this is a probability. Now, I'm not using could, can, or be able to in this case, but it's still using auxiliary verbs. So we should arrive. The possibility is quite strong. In fact, it's a probability. In conversation 2, we can imagine 2 people talking about a party they're going to attend. Person A, did they say what time we have to be there? person B, yes, we should arrive by 1 p.m. We should arrive by 1 p.m. This is something that we are supposed to do. So the first one is showing the likely time that they will arrive. The second one is showing a responsibility to be there at a certain time. So if it was conversation 1, I would say it like this: we should arrive by 1 p.m. In conversation 2, we should arrive by 1 p.m. Conversation 1, we should arrive by 1 p.m. Conversation 2, we should arrive by 1 p.m. So I'm not sure how much of a difference you can hear in those two intonations, but it's another interesting part of auxiliary verbs that I've used should in this example, but with could, can, and be able to, and all the other auxiliary verbs, the context, the intonation, and other things all play a part in being able to understand what a sentence means without making an error in judgment. All right, so that's basically all I have for today's seminar about auxiliary verbs, but I think we've covered some of the most difficult aspects and perhaps some of the most confusing parts of auxiliary verb use, although we really only looked at one particular type of auxiliary verb. I think it's definitely the one which causes the most problems and the one that I get asked about the most. So I think it's something that most people are worried about or having trouble with. That being said, auxiliary verbs are not impossible, and everybody can learn them, but it does take a little bit of time and practice to be able to use them correctly. So I hope everybody found this seminar to be useful, and I'm going to be making 2 more about tense and articles in the future, so hopefully you will enjoy watching them as well. But that's all from me for today. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.